Okay, let's have a quick look then at the cardiac cycle. Now, the cardiac cycle is the sequence of events that have to take place each time your heart makes one complete beat. Okay, it's made up of three parts. So we've got diastole, we've got atrial systole, and ventricular systole. So diastole is probably the easiest to remember. So diastole is what's known as the relaxation and filling phase of the heart. And basically, during this phase, the heart is not contracting, so the cardiac muscle isn't contracting, the heart is completely relaxed, and the atria are filling with blood. Okay. Things to remember then during this phase, obviously that the atria fill with blood, and we also need to remember that the atrio-ventricular valves, that's the valves between the atria and the ventricles, your bicuspid and your tricuspid valve, they remain closed, and they have to be closed because if they weren't closed, blood would flow into the heart, into the atria, and then would just go straight down through into the ventricles. Okay, so it's the relaxation and filling phase, atria filling with blood, and we need to remember that those AV valves are closed. We also need to know the timing. So the timing for this is the relaxation and filling phase takes 0.4 of a second, 0.4 seconds. Okay. We then have atrial systole. So during atrial systole, what happens is the atrial walls contract. And as the atrial walls contract, the AV valves, so those atrio-ventricular valves, the bicuspid and the tricuspid valves, they are forced open. And then what begins to happen is the ventricles will start to fill with blood. So atrial walls contract, AV valves are forced open, ventricles fill with blood, and as the ventricles fill with blood, we need to remember as well that the semilunar valves have to remain closed. Now, the semilunar valves are the two valves that feed the aorta and the pulmonary artery. So basically, those valves are closed, and we need them to remain closed because we don't want blood leaking out of the heart because the ventricles aren't contracting yet. So the AV valves, sorry, not the AV valves, these semilunar valves remain closed. And then that takes 0.3 seconds. And then the final phase of the cardiac cycle is ventricular systole. So this is where the ventricles are contracting, and as the ventricles contract, blood is ejected from the heart. It obviously can leave the heart in two places. It's either going to be leaving the left ventricle and entering the aorta, being pumped around the body, that's your oxygenated blood, or it's going to be leaving the right ventricle, in which case it's entering the pulmonary artery and it's going up to your lungs. That's deoxygenated blood going up to the lungs to be oxygenated. Okay, so during ventricular systole, ventricle walls contract, those atrio-ventricular valves, the valves between the atria and the ventricles, have now got to close because we don't want blood going backwards, back up into the atria. So the AV valves are closed. And that prevents backflow of blood. And these semilunar valves, so the valves that control blood flow into the aorta and the pulmonary artery, they are now going to open. So your aortic semilunar valve and your pulmonary semilunar valve are going to open. So SL valves open. And this phase of the cardiac cycle takes 0.1 of a second. Okay, right, let's run through that again then in sequence. So to begin with, the heart is relaxing, it's filling with blood, and that's known as diastole. So it's a relaxation filling phase. That means the atria are filling with blood. This is blood returning either from the lungs down the pulmonary vein or from the body, so the vena cava. Okay, so the atria are filling with blood. Your AV valves are closed, so we don't want lots of blood entering the ventricles. One thing to perhaps add to that that we need to remember is that you have what's called passive filling. So we'll put passive filling on in brackets there. And that's basically where a little bit of blood can get past your AV valves and a little bit of blood can drip through into the ventricles, but not very much. That's known as passive filling. So those AV valves aren't completely watertight. They do let a little bit of blood through them in the right direction, so moving from the atria to the ventricles, and that's known as passive filling, but it's just a little bit of a drip getting through. It's not a lot of blood flow. Okay, that takes 0.4 of a second, the filling phase does. We then move on to the first part of the heart actually beating. Okay, that's atrial systole. So your atrial walls contract, your AV valves are forced open, so blood's now allowed to make its way down into the ventricles, and that means the ventricles can fill with blood. And your semilunar valves, it's important that we remember they remain closed. So the aortic semilunar valve and the pulmonary semilunar valve are closed because you don't want any blood leaving the heart yet. That takes 0.3 of a second. And then we finish up with ventricular systoles. This is where the ventricles are contracting. So the ventricle walls contract. Atrio-ventricular valves are now closed because you don't want blood backflowing and going back up into the atria. And the semilunar valves open, and that's allowing blood to enter the aorta and then enter the pulmonary artery. And that takes 0.1 of a second. And that means that your full heartbeat, when you add 0.4, 0.3, 0.1, takes 0.8 seconds. Okay, and that's where we get our average heartbeat of 72 beats per minute, because your heart is beating every 0.8 of a second at rest on average.